The night sky over Seattle was painted in deep shades of violet and orange, and the city's skyscrapers glistened in the waning light. As Dr. Danielle Carter exited the conference center, the fresh air was a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere inside, where she had spent the past 3 days surrounded by colleagues and emergency medicine experts. The prestigious Global Emergency Medicine Summit had come to an end, and Danielle was ready for a break from the relentless networking, smiling, and formalities. She walked slowly, pulling her small suitcase behind her. The familiar weight of her handbag hung over her shoulder, the conference badge still dangling around her neck, identifying her as Dr. Danielle Carter, emergency physician. But for once, she was happy to leave that identity behind, even if only for a few hours. All she wanted now was peace and quiet. It had been a whirlwind week. Danielle gave a keynote speech on innovative emergency response techniques, a milestone in her career. She was one of the few Black women in her field who had reached such prominence, and while the recognition was gratifying, the pressure had been immense. The constant need to prove herself in order to excel in a space predominantly dominated by white men weighed on her more than she liked to admit. She hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat and sighing as the driver loaded her luggage into the trunk. The soft leather of the seat provided her with a small comfort as she sank into it, feeling her muscles slowly begin to relax. She had meticulously planned this trip, booking a first-class seat on her flight back to Atlanta. It was a small luxury, but after the intensity of the conference, she felt she had earned it. "CAC Airport, please," she said softly to the driver as the car pulled away from the curb. Danielle allowed herself a rare moment of introspection. The jazz playing faintly on the radio blended with the hum of the engine, and for the first time in days, she could hear her own thoughts. She looked out at the city through the window, the buildings towering over streets filled with people moving in every direction, each caught up in their own lives. It was in moments like these that Danielle felt most distant from the world around her. She rested her head against the cold window, watching as the skyline blurred while the cab made its way through downtown. Despite the traffic, the city was full of energy, but Danielle felt disconnected, floating among her thoughts, meditating on her exhaustion and the way every achievement in her life seemed to require twice the effort compared to her peers. That was the reality of being a Black woman in a profession that, despite advancements, often seemed determined to remind her she was an outsider. She thought about the roundtable on diversity and medicine she attended on the last day of the summit. Though the room was filled with smiles and polite nods, there was an underlying tension in the air, a tacit acknowledgement that, for people like Danielle, success didn't come solely from talent. It came from enduring slights and dismissals her colleagues rarely faced. "Dr. Carter, could you expand on the challenges you faced as a woman of color in the medical field?" one of the moderators had asked. Her tone was almost overly sympathetic. Danielle smiled, offering the polished response she always gave at these events, a carefully measured mix of optimism and realism. But the truth, the one she rarely expressed, was that it wasn't just the overt instances of racism that were hard to bear, but the constant, unspoken assumptions, like the way some eyes widened slightly when they realized she was the lead doctor, or the subtle manner in which some patients questioned her credentials in ways they never did with her white colleagues. As the airport came into view, Danielle pulled herself from her thoughts. The cab slowed to a stop at the curb, and the driver handed her luggage to a nearby porter. She thanked him, paid the fare, and walked towards the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. The chaos of the airport whirled around her, families rushing towards their gates, flight announcements blaring over the speakers, and the endless hum of rolling suitcases. Danielle moved through it all with practiced ease, already visualizing the comfort of her first-class seat and the brief respite it would offer her. The check-in counter for first-class passengers was tucked into a quieter corner of the terminal. As she approached, she was greeted by a smiling airline attendant. The young woman glanced with interest at Danielle's conference badge before offering a polite, albeit rehearsed, greeting. "Good evening, Dr. Carter." "Back home?" "Yes, back to Atlanta," Danielle responded, returning the smile. The attendant quickly processed her information, scanning her ticket and passport. As she handed Danielle's documents back, she tilted her head slightly. Long trip. Danielle nodded, feeling the deep exhaustion in her bones. It's been a busy week. The woman gave her a sympathetic look. Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. First class should give you a nice rest. Thank you, Danielle said, taking her boarding pass and heading towards the security line reserved for first-class passengers. As she waited in line, Danielle took a moment to reflect on the strangeness of airports, the way they seem to exist in their own dimension, a sideways space between destinations where people came and went without ever really inhabiting the place. It was one of the few places where she found a kind of peace, a place where she could blend into the crowd and simply be another traveler. The security process was quick, and before long, she was strolling through the spacious concourse, her eyes scanning the shops and restaurants lining the terminal. She wasn't hungry, but the familiar routine of walking through an airport gave her a sense of normalcy after the intense days she had spent at the conference. Passing by a newsstand, she saw her reflection in the glass. She paused for a moment, studying her appearance. Her dark brown skin glowed softly under the fluorescent lights, and her short, curly hair was carefully styled, framing her face in a way that exuded confidence and calm. Her professional attire, dress slacks and an elegant blouse, reflected the career she had fought so hard to build, but there was a weariness in her eyes that no amount of professional composure could hide. Danielle's thoughts wandered as she continued walking. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point in her life, a journey filled with both personal and professional obstacles. Being a Black woman in medicine had always been a challenge, but she had persevered. Yet, even as she made her mark on the field, there was always a part of her that remained guarded, aware of the subtle biases that still persisted. Already waiting, but Danielle leaned towards an empty seat next to the window. She sank into the chair and looked at her phone, checking for any last-minute emails from the hospital. As expected, there were several messages waiting for her, questions about upcoming shifts, patient updates, and requests for her input on various cases. Danielle quickly responded to some of the more urgent emails, but her heart wasn't in it. She had hoped to rest during this flight, but now the thought of closing her eyes and drifting away seemed impossible. The weight of the evening's events hung over her like a storm cloud, refusing to let her go. The boarding announcement came soon after, and Danielle was one of the first to stand up and head to the gate. The airline attendant scanned her boarding pass with a smile, and Danielle stepped onto the jet bridge. The noise of the airport faded behind her. The moment Danielle entered the first-class cabin, she felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The wide, plush leather seats and the dim lighting created an atmosphere that was worlds away from the bustling terminal. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, offering to store her carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter. Let us know if you need anything during the flight," the attendant said with a smile. Danielle nodded politely, her tired smile barely masking the exhaustion she felt. "Thank you. I think I just need some peace," she replied, settling into her seat. She adjusted the seat back and placed her noise-canceling headphones around her neck. She allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like days. The hum of the airplane engines, the soft murmur of the few other passengers already seated, all of it created a sense of calm that Danielle desperately needed. She was about to close her eyes when she noticed a small commotion near the front of the cabin. A young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was struggling with his seatbelt, his face scrunched up in frustration. His mother, a tall, slender white woman, was busy arranging their bags in the overhead compartment, her expression tense with annoyance. Danielle's instincts kicked in before she could stop herself. She leaned forward slightly and smiled at the boy. "Let me help you with that," she said softly, reaching out to fasten his seatbelt. The boy looked up with wide eyes, his frustration turning into a grateful smile. "Thank you," he exclaimed, his enthusiasm contagious. Danielle smiled back, but as she returned to her seat, she caught the cold gaze of the boy's mother. Her expression was neutral, but there was something about the way she looked at Danielle that sent a familiar chill down her spine, a tension in her lips, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. Danielle had seen that look before, countless times. It was a look that spoke silently, without words. She brushed it off, convinced that the woman was probably just stressed about traveling with a young child, but the moment lingered, casting a shadow over the peace Danielle had hoped to find on this flight. More passengers filed into the first-class cabin, but Danielle barely noticed them, too focused on trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease that had settled over her. She tried to shake the discomfort off, leaning her head back against the plush headrest. Her plan was simple: disconnect, close her eyes, and lose herself in the soft hum of the airplane as it took off into the sky. But Cody's mother's gaze, that silent, sharp judgment, stayed with her longer than it should have. Traveling had always been a solitary experience for Danielle, a chance to disconnect from the world and its constant demands. She normally enjoyed traveling for this very reason. It was a moment in time where no one could reach her, where she didn't have to wear the mantle of Dr. Danielle Carter, the ever-composed and professional ER physician. But tonight, that mantle felt heavier than usual, and the first-class cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt slightly stifling. She pulled out her phone again, glancing at her emails, more reminders of the work waiting for her at the hospital in Atlanta. She scanned through the messages without really reading them, more out of habit than necessity. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she closed her inbox and put the phone away. The weight of the conference, the constant need to perform, and now this small moment of racial tension that she couldn't ignore, all swirled in her mind, making it impossible to relax. As the flight attendants began the safety demonstration routine, Danielle rested her head against the window, watching as the runway lights blurred while the plane slowly taxied. She closed her eyes, hoping to finally drift off, even if only for a few minutes. But just as she began to sink into the silence, she heard a voice behind her, sharp and irritated. "I'm not sitting next to her." Danielle's eyes snapped open for a moment. She wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. The voice was low but unmistakably firm, the kind of tone that suggested the speaker was holding back their real frustration. Danielle straightened in her seat, straining to hear more. She glanced over her shoulder just enough to catch a glimpse of the woman's face, Cody's mother. "I'm not sitting next to her." "I'm sorry, ma'am," responded the flight attendant's voice, gentle but clearly confused. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," the woman hissed, her voice rising slightly, her irritation evident. "I don't want to sit next to her." Danielle felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt, but the venom with which they were spoken. She knew immediately that the woman wasn't talking about seat arrangements or personal space. This was about her, about the color of her skin. A wave of nausea washed over her. Though she tried to fight it, her grip tightening around the armrest of her seat as the familiar heat of indignation rose in her chest. She wanted to say something, to turn around and confront the woman who had dared to speak of her as if she weren't even human, but years of experience had taught her to pause, to wait. Danielle took a deep breath, her mind racing as she weighed her options. She had faced worse instances, subtle and not so subtle, of racism throughout her life, both inside and outside the hospital. There had been patients who refused to let her touch them, staff members who underestimated her skills, and countless moments when her competence was questioned simply because she didn't fit the image they expected. But this was something else. This was pure, unfiltered disdain, spilling out of the woman's mouth as if she had every right to demand that Danielle be removed simply for existing. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all the seats are assigned. We are fully booked in first class. There's nowhere else to move you." "Then move her to another seat," the woman snapped, her voice growing louder, the anger barely contained. "I paid for first class, and I expect to be treated properly." Danielle's heart pounded in her chest, her blood rushing to her ears. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' gazes on her, but no one said a word. The silence around her felt oppressive, like a thick blanket of indifference. She wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. No one ever intervened in moments like this. The flight attendant looked at Danielle, her expression torn and apologetic. Danielle knew what was coming even before the woman opened her mouth. This wasn't the first time someone had asked her to make others feel more comfortable at her own expense. Dr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, the flight attendant began, her voice hesitant. Would it be possible for you to? Danielle's stomach twisted. There it was, the familiar request. Could you be the one to move? Could you be the one to give up your seat? Her peace, her dignity, just so someone else could feel more comfortable in their bigotry. She had been here before, in different forms and settings. It always felt the same. For a moment, she wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stand her ground, to demand the respect she deserved. She had earned her spot in first class not just by paying for the ticket, but by enduring years of hard work to become one of the most respected emergency physicians in her field. She deserved to sit there just as much as anyone else. But the exhaustion, the deep fatigue from the conference, and a lifetime of fighting these battles weighed heavily on her. She was tired, so tired of always having to rise above, of having to be the bigger person. It wasn't fair. It never had been. But fairness had never been the world Danielle lived in. With a deep breath, Danielle slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, gathering her belongings with a deliberate calm that concealed the storm raging within her. The woman who had demanded her removal watched with smug satisfaction, her arms crossed over her chest as if she had won some kind of victory. Danielle didn't look at her. She turned to the flight attendant, who looked visibly relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you so much, Dr. Carter," the flight attendant whispered, her tone genuinely apologetic. "I'll find you a seat in economy." Danielle nodded without saying a word. She could feel the other passengers' gazes like a knife in her stomach. Some of them had probably witnessed the entire exchange, but no one had intervened. It was always easier to pretend it wasn't their problem. She reached the crowded economy section and settled into her new seat, which contrasted starkly with the luxury she had just left behind. The armrest dug into her sides, and there was barely any room for her legs, but that wasn't what bothered her. It was the humiliation, the way they had made her feel small, invisible, unworthy of the comfort and space she had paid for. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Danielle looked out the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, strong, serene, but undeniably wounded. She tried to focus on her breathing to calm the rising tide of frustration and anger threatening to overwhelm her. She hadn't asked for this. All she wanted was to get home in peace, to enjoy a few hours of quiet before returning to the chaos of the emergency room. But once again, she was reminded that no matter how far she had come, no matter how successful she was, there would still be people who saw her as less. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from the hospital reminding her of her upcoming shift. She grimaced and turned it off without reading the message. Work never truly left her, even when she was miles away from her responsibilities. But tonight, the weight of the hospital's demands didn't compare to the weight of what had just happened. Danielle rested her head against the window, closing her eyes as the plane soared at 30,000 feet. She tried to let the steady hum of the engines soothe her, but the events of the past hour replayed in her mind over and over. No matter how much she tried to shake them, the sting of those words, that cold look of contempt from Cody's mother, cut deeper than she had expected. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses in first class. Danielle couldn't help but wonder how many of the other passengers had witnessed the scene and done nothing. Their indifference was almost as painful as the woman's open hostility. She took another deep breath, trying to remind herself that she was stronger than this. She had faced worse, overcome greater obstacles, and built a life most people could only dream of. But even as she repeated those words in her mind, the bitterness lingered as always. Danielle sat stiffly in the cramped economy seat, her shoulders brushing uncomfortably against the edges of the seat. The transition from the spacious luxury of first class to the tight confines of economy was jarring, not just physically, but also emotionally. She had been relegated to this space not because of some seating error, but because of someone's unspoken prejudice. The soft murmur of conversation around her felt distant, almost like a muffled soundtrack to her thoughts. She looked out the window. watching as the dark night sky swallowed the last glimmers of the city lights below, the steady rhythm of the plane. She was still struggling to find space in a world that often refused to make room for her. Danielle sighed, closing her eyes as she tried to shake off the heaviness of the past. She was stronger now, more resilient. She had built a career as a respected emergency physician, and no one could take that away from her. But still, the scars from those early years persisted, surfacing in moments like this, when she was reminded that, no matter how far she had come, the world still saw her in ways she could not control. The plane moved out of the turbulence, fading into a soft hum. Once again, Danielle forced herself to relax, taking slow, deep breaths as she focused on the steady rhythm of the engines. She needed to clear her mind, to let go of the tension that had settled in her chest. After all, there was nothing she could do now. She had chosen to move to economy to avoid a confrontation, and now all she could do was endure the long flight ahead. But just as she began to slip into a light sleep, she heard a sound that cut through the quiet hum of the cabin, like a sharp alarm, the cry of a child, high-pitched and full of panic. The engines of the plane should have been calming, but instead, they only amplified the tension coiling inside her chest. Danielle's mind buzzed with a cocktail of frustration, disappointment, and exhaustion. There was a time when she would have reacted, when she might have spoken up, demanded respect, and refused to be moved from her rightful seat. But tonight, the weight of countless similar encounters over the years was too heavy to bear. The subtle and blatant slights she had faced throughout her career had piled up like stones, each adding to the burden, until it felt unbearable. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the headrest. She was used to being underestimated. Even when she was a child growing up in Georgia, Danielle quickly learned that the world wasn't fair to people who looked like her. Teachers doubted her abilities despite her natural aptitude for science and math, and later, even in medical school, she had found professors and classmates who saw her as an outsider. But she had persevered. She had overcome every challenge, every slight, and built a life for herself that most people could only dream of. And yet, here she was once again, forced to compromise her dignity for the comfort of someone else's ignorance. Danielle shifted in her seat, feeling the tension in her chest grow. She thought about how she had handled the situation in first class, how she had swallowed her pride and moved without making a scene. She knew it was the right thing to do to keep her composure, but part of her wished she had stood her ground. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter across the aisle. Danielle looked over to see a group of businessmen chatting loudly, their suits and ties slightly disheveled as they settled into their seats. One of them, a middle-aged man with a silver tie, leaned over to his companion with a mocking grin. "Looks like someone couldn't handle first class," he murmured, his voice low but not low enough to go unheard. Danielle's jaw clenched as she turned her gaze back to the window. She could feel the familiar burn of anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had long since mastered the art of masking her emotions, of keeping her face neutral and composed even when every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. But tonight, it was harder than usual. The man's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the countless times people had questioned her place in spaces she had earned with hard work and perseverance. Whether it was in the hospital's boardroom or in a first-class cabin, there were always people who assumed she didn't belong. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to let the anger slide away from her, but it clung to her like a shadow that refused to be ignored. She looked at her phone, checking the time. The flight had barely begun, and the thought of enduring several more hours of this tension made her stomach twist. Suddenly, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jostling her in her seat. The overhead compartments rattled, and the passengers around her murmured nervously, their voices rising as the plane shook. Danielle gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the turbulence passed, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the simmering frustration that had been building since she boarded the plane. Thoughts that took her back to her time in medical school, to the beginning of her journey into a world that often felt unwelcoming. She remembered the long study nights, the endless rounds of clinical rotations, and the constant pressure to prove herself. There were moments of triumph, yes, but also moments of deep doubt, times when she wondered if the weight of her identity was too much to bear in a field that didn't always value her contributions. One particular memory surfaced: her third year of medical school, during her first clinical rotation in the emergency department. She had been anxious, full of energy, and ready to learn, but her enthusiasm had been met with skepticism by one of the supervising doctors, Dr. Richardson, an older white man with a brusque demeanor. He hadn't bothered to hide his doubts about her abilities during one particularly busy night. Danielle had been the first to respond to a critically ill patient, an elderly woman who had suffered cardiac arrest. Danielle had acted quickly, performing chest compressions and guiding the medical team with confidence that belied her inexperience. The patient had survived, and the rest of the team had praised Danielle's quick thinking, but Dr. Richardson had barely acknowledged her role in the patient's survival. Instead, he had pulled her aside afterward, his tone cold and condescending. "You got lucky this time," he had said, his eyes narrowing. "But don't get too comfortable. You've got a lot to prove if you want to make it in this field." The words had hurt, but Danielle had forced herself to smile and nod, knowing that any sign of weakness would only fuel his doubts. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her abilities, and it wouldn't be the last, but she had persevered, determined to rise above the judgments of people like Dr. Richardson. Now, sitting in the cramped economy seat, those memories felt all too familiar. The faces had changed, but the underlying bias remained the same. She had been relegated to this space not because of some seating mistake, but because of someone's unspoken prejudice. The soft murmur of conversation around her felt distant, almost like a muffled soundtrack to her thoughts. She looked out the window, watching as the dark night sky swallowed the last glimmers of the city lights below, the plane's steady rhythm a dull metronome. She was still struggling for space in a world that often refused to make room for her. Danielle sighed, closing her eyes as she tried to shake off the heaviness of the past. She was stronger now, more resilient. She had built a career as a respected emergency physician, and no one could take that away from her. But still, the scars of those early years persisted, resurfacing in moments like this, when she was reminded that no matter how far she had come, the world still saw her in ways she couldn't control. The plane moved out of the turbulence, fading into a gentle hum. Once again, Danielle forced herself to relax, taking slow, deep breaths as she focused on the steady rhythm of the engines. She needed to clear her mind, to let go of the tension that had settled in her chest. After all, there was nothing she could do now. She had chosen to move to economy to avoid a confrontation, and now all she could do was endure the long flight ahead. But just as she began to slip into a light sleep, she heard a sound that cut through the quiet hum of the cabin, like a sharp alarm, the cry of a child, high-pitched and full of panic. Danielle's memories flowed as she tried to calm herself. She knew she had to keep her composure, but the panic she heard now was real and urgent. The child's cry was like a call to action, a signal that she couldn't ignore. Her experience as an emergency physician had prepared her for critical situations, and though she had tried to leave behind the accumulated stress and tension, this moment required her immediate intervention. She recognized that cry instantly. It was Cody. Danielle's instincts kicked in immediately, erasing all traces of exhaustion and frustration. She stood up quickly, her eyes darting to the front of the cabin where she saw Cody, the child she had helped with his seatbelt, struggling in his seat. His small hands clutched at his throat, his face red and twisted in fear as he gasped for air. A familiar sense of dread settled over Danielle as she realized what was happening. Cody was having an asthma attack. Without thinking, Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt and quickly made her way to Cody's seat. The flight attendants were already there, their faces pale with worry, but clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Cody's mother, the same woman who had demanded Danielle move, was frantic, her hands flailing uselessly around Cody, her voice loud and panicked as she begged him to breathe, but it was clear Cody couldn't. His breaths were shallow and strained, each one a desperate gasp that wasn't reaching his lungs. Danielle didn't wait for permission. She moved quickly to Cody's side, kneeling next to his seat and placing a gentle hand on his back. "I'm a doctor," she said firmly, addressing both the flight attendants and Cody's mother. "He's having an asthma attack. Does he have an inhaler?" Cody's mother, Melissa, hearing her name earlier, looked up at Danielle, her face a mixture of terror and shock. For a moment, she seemed unable to process what Danielle had said, her eyes wide and unfocused. But then, as if snapping out of a trance, she shook her head frantically. "No, he doesn't have it in the car," Melissa responded, her voice trembling, her hands shaking as she held Cody's small arm. "I thought he wouldn't need it." Danielle's heart sank. An asthma attack at 30,000 feet without an inhaler was a dangerous situation. They needed to get Cody's breathing under control, and fast. "Listen, Melissa," Danielle said in her calm, authoritative voice as she turned to Cody's mother. "I need you to help me keep him calm. The more he panics, the harder it'll be for him to breathe. Can you do that?" Melissa nodded, her eyes filled with tears as she reached out to Cody, trying to soothe him despite her own panic. Danielle turned to the nearest flight attendant, who was hovering by Cody's seat, anxious. "I need oxygen now," Danielle said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Bring me an oxygen mask and a tank, and any other medical supplies you have on board." The flight attendant nodded quickly and hurried off to retrieve the supplies. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, who was still gasping for air, his small chest rising and falling in uneven, frantic movements. "Hey, Cody," Danielle said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm going to help you, okay? But I need you to try to breathe slowly with me. Can you do that?" She took a deep breath, demonstrating how to breathe in slowly and exhale in a steady stream. Cody tried to mimic her, but his breaths were still shallow and labored, his wide eyes filled with fear, locked on Danielle. In that moment, she could see the trust he was placing in her, despite the panic and pain. He believed she could help him. The flight attendant returned with the oxygen tank, and Danielle wasted no time in fitting the mask over Cody's face. She adjusted the oxygen flow, watching closely as his breathing began to slow, still labored but improving. Melissa, her voice thick with emotion, whispered to her son, "You'll be okay, baby. Dr. Carter is helping you." Danielle looked at Melissa, noting the change in her tone, the softness, the gratitude that hadn't been there before. The same woman who had looked at her with such disdain just hours earlier now relied on her to save her child's life, but there was no time to dwell on that. Cody's breathing was still unstable, and without his inhaler, they were relying entirely on the oxygen to keep him calm. Danielle focused all her attention on Cody, guiding him through each breath, her hands steady on his shoulder, her voice remaining calm even as her mind raced with possible scenarios. They needed to stabilize him. If his condition worsened, they would have no choice but to make an emergency landing. As she worked, Danielle could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their previous indifference replaced by something closer to respect, but that didn't matter to her now. All that mattered was keeping Cody safe. Cody's breathing had begun to stabilize thanks to the steady flow of oxygen, but his condition was still precarious. Danielle remained kneeling at his side, monitoring his pulse and watching for any signs of increased distress. Melissa sat beside her son, her eyes never leaving Cody's face, but there was something else in her gaze now, something deeper, more vulnerable. Danielle could feel the shift in the air between them. Melissa had gone from treating Danielle like an intruder to depending on her completely. It wasn't just desperation, it was a realization that she had been wrong. Wrong for judging Danielle, wrong for making assumptions based on. "I don't know what I would have done without you, baby," Melissa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She kept her focus on Cody, adjusting the oxygen mask as he began to breathe more deeply and regularly, but she could feel the weight of Melissa's words, the unspoken apology hanging in the air between them. Melissa's voice broke as she spoke again, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I judged you. I treated you terribly. I can't believe I did that." Finally, Danielle met Melissa's gaze, her expression calm but inscrutable. "Focus on Cody right now," she said gently. "We'll deal with the rest later." Melissa nodded, swallowing hard as she wiped away a tear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, feeling a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't looking for gratitude or an apology, but the change in Melissa's tone and attitude was undeniable. It was a reminder of how quickly perceptions could change, of how easily someone could go from seeing her as less than to realizing their life or the life of someone they loved was in her hands. The cabin had fallen silent, the tension palpable as the other passengers watched the scene unfold. Danielle could feel their collective unease, their discomfort with what had happened before now overshadowed by their concern for Cody. She had become the center of their attention, not because of the color of her skin, but because she was the person saving a child's life. For a moment, Danielle allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion, the frustration, the injustice of having to prove her worth over and over again, but she didn't let it consume her. There would be time to reflect later. Now, her focus was on keeping Cody stable. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Cody's breathing was now regular, and although his face was still pale, the panic had left his eyes. He held tightly to his mother's hand, but the terror that had gripped him earlier had ebbed away. Danielle slowly stood up, her knees stiff from kneeling for so long. She looked at the flight attendant who was nearby, a look of quiet admiration on her face. "We need to keep him on oxygen until we land," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If anything changes, we'll need to make an emergency landing." The flight attendant nodded quickly and hurried off to inform the captain. Melissa remained seated, her hands still wrapped around Cody, but her gaze was fixed on Danielle, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. As Danielle returned to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her once again, but this time their gazes were different. There was no judgment or disdain, but something that resembled respect. She didn't need their validation, but it felt good to know that in this moment they saw her for who she really was, a doctor, a professional, and someone who had earned her place in the world, no matter what others thought. Despite the brief relief that came with stabilizing Cody's breathing, Danielle knew better than to let her guard down. Asthma attacks were unpredictable, especially at high altitudes, and without his inhaler, they were only buying time. The steady flow of oxygen was helping, but it wasn't a cure. Danielle looked at Cody, his small chest rising and falling beneath the oxygen mask. He was calm now, but his skin was still pale, and she could hear the faint wheezing in his breath, a worrisome sound that sent a shiver of concern through her. Melissa, still sitting next to her son, seemed to feel the lingering tension. She was watching Danielle closely, her earlier panic replaced by a quieter, more fragile concern. Her hands shook as she stroked Cody's hair, her eyes darting between him and Danielle as if she were hoping for some guarantee that everything would be okay. Danielle kept her voice steady as she spoke. "He's stable for now, but without his inhaler, we need to be prepared for things to change. We need to keep him calm and help him breathe slowly." Melissa nodded through her tears, trying to compose herself enough to do what Danielle asked. She leaned closer to Cody, speaking softly to him, her voice trembling but full of a mother's desperate love. "It's okay, baby. We're going to get through this. Just keep breathing, all right?" Danielle watched as Melissa tried to remain calm, her prejudice and anger forgotten in the face of her son's struggle. There was no room for anything else now, no judgment, no resentment, just the overwhelming fear of a mother who... If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your growth journey, take action and subscribe to the channel Vidasto Inspiration to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left for you. And if you think this message could inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.